From New York, this is Democracy Now! Bells rang out through Hiroshima, Japan at 8:15 this morning to mark the moment 75 years ago today when the U.S. dropped the world's first atomic bomb, ultimately killing an estimated 140,000 people.
On August 6, 1945, a single atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima. Rumor at the time had it that nothing will grow here for 75 years, and yet Hiroshima recovered, becoming a symbol of peace, with many people from all over the world visiting the city.
3 days after the Hiroshima bombing, the U.S. dropped a second nuclear bomb on the Japanese city of Nagasaki. We'll speak to a survivor of the Hiroshima bombing, Hideko Tamura Snyder, whose mother died in the attack.
I really, really wish this beautiful land of yours will keep its life and the light and the beauty without ever suffering nuclear winter or the horrible torture of the bomb exploding like it did on us 75 years ago. I survived Hiroshima.
We'll also speak to Greg Mitchell, the former editor of the Nuclear Times, author of the new book, The Beginning or the End: How Hollywood and America Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Lebanon, the death toll from Tuesday's massive explosion at the port of Beirut has risen to 137, with dozens still missing, over 5,000 injured, and some 300,000 people left homeless. The explosion completely leveled Lebanon's largest grain silo, leaving the country with less than a month's reserve of grain. Beirut's mayor says 300,000 people lost their homes in the explosion, compounding a humanitarian crisis that followed economic collapse and a surge of coronavirus cases across Lebanon. Officials say the blast was triggered by over 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate stored in a warehouse at Beirut's port. The highly explosive industrial fertilizer was reportedly seized from a Russian-leased cargo ship bound for Mozambique in 2013, but never properly secured. The Lebanese government says it's placed several port officials under house arrest. Meanwhile, public outrage at government officials is exploding across Lebanon, with the hashtag #HangUpTheNooses trending on social media. The U.S. death toll from the coronavirus outbreak has surpassed 158,000. Over 1,200 new deaths were reported Wednesday in the United States, including 225 in Florida, where the number of cases has surpassed 500,000. California recorded another 135 deaths as the state's death toll approaches 10,000. On Wednesday, Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti threatened to start shutting off water and electricity to properties hosting large parties in an attempt to slow the spread of the virus. Meanwhile, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio has announced New York is setting up checkpoints targeting visitors from COVID-19 hotspots.
We will have checkpoints at key entry points to the city. Travelers coming in from those states will be given information about the quarantine. They will be reminded that it is required, not optional.
India recorded 904 deaths over the past 24 hours. It's the biggest single-day total since the pandemic began there. 8 coronavirus patients died in a hospital fire in the state of Gujarat. The total COVID-19 death toll in India has now surpassed 40,000, the 5th highest total in the world. Facebook has removed a video posted to Donald Trump's personal account saying it violates a policy against harmful COVID-19 misinformation. Twitter has also banned the video, which featured clips from a Fox News segment Wednesday in which President Trump urges schools to reopen, falsely claiming children are, quote, almost immune from this disease. Nearly 250,000 U.S. children have tested positive for the coronavirus, with hundreds suffering from multi-system inflammatory syndrome. At least 6 U.S. children have died of COVID-19. In Mississippi, 116 students have been sent home to quarantine after 6 students and 1 staff member tested positive in a newly reopened school in the city of Corinth. Researchers warn that for many children, there may be lasting consequences from the novel coronavirus, including lung damage and neurological side effects. This comes as a large contact tracing study in South Korea found children and teens between the ages of 10 to 19 are more likely to spread the coronavirus than young children or adults. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the nation's leading expert on infectious diseases, has revealed he now needs security due to threats against him and his family.
Getting death threats for me and my family and harassing my daughters to the point where I have to get security is just, I mean, it's amazing. I wouldn't have imagined in my wildest dreams that people who object to things that are pure public health principles are so set against it and don't like what you and I say, namely in the word of science, that they actually threaten you. I mean, that to me is just strange.
President Trump has not invited Dr. Fauci or any other scientists to address his press briefing, which he began again daily a few weeks ago. The watchdog group Public Citizen has accused pharmaceutical giant Gilead of putting profit ahead of public health as it works to develop a treatment for the coronavirus. Public Citizen says Gilead has focused on promoting remdesivir as a possible treatment instead of a related drug that may be more effective and easier to manufacture. Because of Gilead's patent on remdesivir, it's 5 years longer. Dr. Michael Abrams of Public Citizen said, quote, "It's sadly predictable that Big Pharma responds to a global pandemic by trying to bring to market only those drugs that maximize its profits," unquote. Meanwhile, Johnson & Johnson has reached a $1 billion deal with the U.S. government to make 100 million doses of an experimental COVID-19 vaccine still being tested. The Securities and Exchange Commission is investigating Kodak after a surge in the company's stock just days before the Trump administration gave the company a $765 million loan under the Defense Production Act. The news led to Kodak's stock value soaring by 1,000%. Kodak's CEO was issued a 1.75 million stock options a day before the announcement. The loan was given to help Kodak start making prescription drugs, something it has never done before. The New York Times is reporting Deutsche Bank has handed over detailed financial statements from Donald Trump and his company after being subpoenaed by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office as part of a criminal investigation. Last week, prosecutors filed court documents suggesting they were investigating the Trump Organization for bank and insurance fraud. The Times reports Deutsche Bank has lent Trump and his company more than $2 billion over the last 2 decades. Meanwhile, New York Attorney General Letitia James has announced she'll make a major national announcement this morning. It's unclear what the announcement will be about. At the State Department, Acting Inspector General Stephen Ackard resigned abruptly on Wednesday, less than 3 months after his predecessor was fired by President Trump. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo gave this brief explanation for Ackard's sudden departure.
He left to go back home. This happens. I don't have anything more to add to that.
In May, President Trump fired the State Department's Inspector General Steve Linick, who is probing whether Secretary Pompeo used a political appointee to perform personal tasks for himself and his wife, including walking his dog and taking care of his dry cleaning. Pompeo was also under security for using an emergency declaration to bypass Congress and fast-tracking over $8 billion worth of weapon sales to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Presidential candidate Joe Biden is set to accept the Democratic Party's nomination from his home state of Delaware August 20th, after the Democratic National Convention Wednesday announced plans to move its proceedings entirely online to combat the spread of the coronavirus. Meanwhile, President Trump said Wednesday he may hold his acceptance speech for the Republican Party's nomination on the south lawn of the White House. Asked by reporters about the plan, Senate Republican Whip John Thune replied, "Is that even legal?" Senator Thune cited the Federal Hatch Act, which bars partisan political activity by federal employees in places where they discharge their official duties. Trump later told reporters the Hatch Act does not apply to the president. In more campaign news, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib has defeated Detroit City Council President Brenda Jones in Michigan's Democratic primary held Tuesday. In 2018, Tlaib became the first Palestinian-American woman elected to Congress. Iowa Republican Governor Kim Reynolds on Wednesday restored the voting rights of tens of thousands of formerly incarcerated people with felony convictions, with exceptions for people convicted of murder and other violent crimes. Iowa is the last U.S. state to overturn felony disenfranchisement laws. Florida voters approved a ballot measure in 2018 restoring voting rights for an estimated 1.4 million ex-prisoners convicted of felonies, but a bill signed by Republican Governor Ron DeSantis last year requires them to pay court fines and fees before they can register to vote. The requirement has drawn comparisons to the poll taxes of the Jim Crow South. In Minnesota, Hennepin County District Attorney Mike Freeman Wednesday declined to press charges against Minneapolis police officers who shot and killed an autistic man in a mental health crisis inside the home of his grandparents as they looked on. On August 31st of last year, the grandfather of 21-year-old Kobe Dimmick-Heisler called 911 to report his grandson threatened him with a small knife. When police arrived at the home, family members told officers they were no longer needed because the situation had calmed down. 4 officers entered the home anyway, and after an altercation, 2 of the officers fired 3 rounds each at Kobe Dimmick-Heisler, killing him. On Wednesday, Amity Dimmick-Heisler condemned the DA's decision not to bring charges against the officers who killed her son.
You can't de-escalate an already de-escalated situation. The call had been reversed. They should not have come. They made the decision to come and do whatever they do, which was re-escalate the situation, and then ended up putting my son down like an animal. There's more I want to say, but I can't.
As negotiators in Washington, D.C. continue to debate renewing expanded unemployment benefits during the pandemic, Florida is facing criticism for making it too hard for residents to apply for unemployment. On Wednesday, Florida Republican Governor Ron DeSantis admitted the system was designed like that on purpose.
Having studied how it was internally constructed, I think the goal was, for whoever designed it, was let's put as many kind of pointless roadblocks along the way so people just say, oh, the hell with it, I'm not going to do that.
The daughter of Congressmember Louis Gohmert is speaking out about her father's battle with COVID-19. The Texas Republican congressman tested positive for coronavirus last week after he consistently refused to wear a mask in the U.S. Capitol, forcing several congressional colleagues to self-quarantine, including 72-year-old Arizona Democrat Raul Grijalva, who later tested positive. Caroline Gohmert tweeted a statement reading, quote, "My father ignored medical expertise, and now he has COVID. This has been a heartbreaking battle because I love my dad and don't want him to die. Please listen to medical experts. It's not worth following a president who has no remorse for leading his followers to an early grave," she tweeted. Meanwhile, the 15-year-old daughter of senior White House advisor Kellyanne Conway has reemerged on social media. In July, 15-year-old Claudia Conway posted a TikTok video with the caption, "Last video because my parents are making me delete all social media." She later reemerged on social media making videos in support of Black Lives Matter and LGBTQ rights and mocking President Trump. In Hiroshima, Japan, a temple bell tolled at 8:15 this morning to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the world's first nuclear attack by the United States. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence officials said Wednesday Saudi Arabia has partnered with China to build a secret nuclear facility to extract uranium yellowcake from uranium ore. Such a move would represent a major step by Saudi Arabia toward the construction of a nuclear weapon. When we come back after headlines, we'll devote the show to the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. In Turkey, thousands of women rallied in cities nationwide Wednesday, demanding the government cancel plans to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention, a landmark treaty aimed at preventing violence against women. According to the organization We Will Stop Femicide's platform, at least 474 women were murdered across Turkey last year, most of them by family members or intimate partners. This is lawyer and activist Golsha Kaya speaking at a protest in Istanbul.
The lives of women are already under threat in this country, and revoking the Istanbul Convention would enact a slaughter against all women. That's why we are here today. Although the government says they will delay discussions for revoking the accord, we are here today asking them to take this topic off the table completely.
The Associated Press is reporting more than 2,000 unaccompanied children have been expelled from the United States since March under emergency declaration issued as part of the Trump administration's response to the coronavirus pandemic. And Daisy Coleman, a high school sexual assault survivor who was featured in the documentary Audrey and Daisy, has died at the age of 23 by suicide. She was raped at 14 by a 17-year-old high school football player with political connections, while another student took videos. Charges were initially brought and dropped against the boys accused of assaulting Daisy and videotaping it. When Daisy's mother, Melinda, began to raise questions, she lost her job. The family's house in Maryville, Missouri, mysteriously burned to the ground. Daisy Coleman says she was suspended from the cheerleading squad and incessantly bullied. She was hounded on social media, called a skank and a liar, and urged to kill herself, which she tried to do multiple times. Daisy Coleman would go on to become an advocate for sexual assault victims. In 2016, I interviewed her and her mother at the Sundance Film Festival.
I almost believe that this whole situation did strip me of being, human and what I used to be. But I believe as it stripped me of everything that I used to be, I was able to start from a new building block and build onto someone else. And I think that really shaped who I am today. And I feel like, I think I'm a force to be reckoned with Maryville now. I don't think they're going to be getting away with everything that they do now.
On Wednesday, Daisy Coleman's mother, Melinda, wrote, quote, "She never recovered from what those boys did to her, and it's just not fair. My baby girl is gone," her mom said. To see our full interview with Daisy and her mother, go to DemocracyNow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, the Quarantine Report. When we come back, we spend the hour marking the 75th anniversary of the U.S. atomic bombing of Hiroshima, which ushered in the nuclear age. Stay with us. The composition of Hikari Owe, the son of the Nobel Prize-winning author Kenzaburo Owe, who has since become a composer of classical music. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. "75 years ago today, at 8:15 in the morning, The U.S. dropped the world's first atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Destruction from the bomb was massive. Shock waves, radiation, and heat rays took the lives of some 140,000 people, ultimately. 3 days later, the U.S. dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, killing another 74,000 people. President Harry Truman announced the attack on Hiroshima in a nationally televised address August 6, 1945.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT.
Today, 75 years later, at 8:15 this morning, a temple bell tolled in Hiroshima to commemorate the world's first nuclear attack. Tens of thousands normally gather to commemorate the bombing anniversary, but this year's ceremony at Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park was kept small due to the coronavirus pandemic. Hiroshima Mayor Kazumi Matsui addressed a group of survivors and public officials.
On August 6, 1945, a single atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima. Rumor at the time had it that nothing will grow here for 75 years, and yet Hiroshima recovered, becoming a symbol of peace, with many people from all over the world visiting the city.
For more, we're joined by a survivor of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, Hideko Tamura Snyder. She was 10 years old when the bomb was dropped. Her memoir recounting the moment is titled One Sunny Day, A Child's Memories of Hiroshima. She's a retired psychiatric social worker, founder of One Sunny Day Initiatives, a peace education organization. She's joining us from Medford, Oregon. We welcome you to Democracy Now! It's an honor to have you with us, Hideko Tamura Snyder. Can you go back 75 years ago, 8:15 in the morning in your city of Hiroshima? Tell us where you were and what happened next.
Thank you, Amy, for inviting me. Yes, I remember, even though over 75 years, just like yesterday. I was the happiest child, just home from Country Haven from the night before, thinking so fortunate to be home. The morning was very sunny, birds were chirping, butterflies over flowers. And I was leaning over in my own house with my back to the garden, reading a book. First at 7:30 was a warning siren, but the radio I turned on said, the planes, 3 planes came and turned around and went away. It's safe now. Go back to work. It was safe now. Go back to work so we could resume our daily affairs. And suddenly there was a flash in my peripheral vision. I jumped on my feet and turned around, and simultaneously, practically, with the flash, came a humongous, deafening sound. So huge. I had never, ever heard. And went on just resounding with a huge sound. And luckily, my mother had taught me what to do if something akin to a bomb hitting our house or garden directly, to try to find very sturdy furniture and place myself between, which I did. She said, likely, even if the house collapsed on top of us, there will be a small room left. And I tried to hang on, but I couldn't even squat. The shaking was so huge in whichever way, and thermal wind from the explosion was so violent. Everything was hitting me, even if I was between two sturdy furniture. So I was under the wreckage. I think it was pitch dark. I could not see anything. And I think the sound of it, I did not pass out. I wish that I did. So I remember the sensation, the color, and the smell like yesterday. I think it went on in a pitch dark, almost 10 or 15 minutes. And when the sound subsided, I found myself under the debris. The house was well built with large pillars, so the roof did not come down flat on top of me. But I was not able to get out, and it was an effort trying to move towards where there was a light coming and somehow crawl to get from under the debris. And I was sure that it was one bomb hit our yard. But when we came at, it was a household, the family of the Tamra industry. My grandfather, who had passed away by that time, was the chair of a multinational corporation, and Tamra Industry name, I noticed that in the map of the Allied Forces, American military map, had Tamra Industry clearly marked. I suppose for all incendiary attacks and so forth, they would mark factories, you know, to aim. And so we were one of them, and our house was fairly close to it. When I came up outside, I found myself huge shards of glass were stuck in my foot. And I was an only child, not given to efficient self-care. The smallest scar, I would run to my mother, you know, help me, mother. A little bruise. So I had no idea what to do. I was just terribly, frightened. You couldn't walk around with it. So, Tamra household was filled with Tamla family extended relations. I asked an aunt, "Oh, Auntie, please help me. This horrible thing on my foot." She was not able to help me. Everyone was scarred, bruised, and my father's older brother, Uncle Hisao, who took over the Tamra industry, had barely made it back to the house and was sitting and screaming to us, "It is the end. End has come." And gashing cuts from the middle of his throat I think he had more glass shards than everybody. In the factory, the glasses, when, it was destroyed, stuck all over his body. And he was bleeding from it, and bleeding all over. It was a really very scary sight, as was when I mustered my courage. Nobody is going to help me. I am the only one who can do. And with trembling hand, washed around it after I very slowly picked this huge glass out of my leg, realizing it's the first time I had to do something this awful and this scary, and knew, looking back on it, it was the last day of my childhood. It's a really long story, leaving this scene by myself because the heat of radiation was so strong, multiply by it from the heat that will melt steel so much more and turn the woods on fire and turn buildings on fire. And across the street went with a huge sound, the block full of flame. And I realized we're going to be surrounded and burned to death if we don't escape. And my mother's instruction was, get away from under the debris, go to the river and save yourself, staying by the river and escape along the river. And Hiroshima had several rivers, 7, from a major river coming in and pouring into the inland sea. So that's where I headed. In front of the gate were women on the ground reaching out to me. And these first ladies I saw on the ground bleeding and not even sitting, crawling, were speaking in Korean that I could understand from the gesture, but I was only a child. I've never been hurt the way I was or seen anything like this or the house come down. A child has this feeling your parents are always going to be there and your room is going to be there and, all your books and your world. You don't picture it to change, even though we had been evacuated. And my mother had told me, and I know the B-2900s would go over our sky, and we were in the war. But the child, can't imagine anything changing that drastic, and people dying and bleeding and raising hands and begging, please help. And there was nothing I could do. I was needing a help myself. I don't know how much you like to know, because it's a long story about fleeing that day.
Well, Ms. Hideko Tamura Snyder, thank you so much for that extremely powerful account. We wanted to know if you could say a little about what happened to your mother and to your siblings, and also the ongoing health impacts of radiation, of the dropping of this nuclear bomb on Hiroshima?
Okay. I never wanted to accept it, but the last she was seeing was screaming as the heavy concrete, a part of the building, falling on her. She was buried alive and burned alive at barely 30 years of age. A beautiful woman and very loving. I was an only child, therefore no sibling, but I had a sibling-like playmate, beloved cousin. I lived under the same cousin Hideyuki. The last he was seen, he was with over 8,000 children at Ground Zero, barely being able to walk, but a classmate of his, months after the explosion, told us. He caught up with him, "Aren't you Tamra?" Because, you know, all his clothes are burned and skin hanging. But the shape of his head, he sort of kind of recognized it must be my cousin. And he said, yes. And so the two started to walk a little bit. My cousin was barely making it. Then the plane came back. And we all thought that they came to shoot, like in the other kinds of attack.
Hideko Tamura, you suffered radiation sickness. Can you describe what that was like? You're a child.
Oh, yes, yes. I was caught up with my cousin's story. I'm sorry. I loved him so much that I just slowed down. I was covered with boils in August afterwards. And then suddenly I started to run very high fever, off the chart. Hair falling, stomach trouble. And I think I bordered life and death for weeks. And then finally it came down. But followed with jaundice. My eyes were completely yellowed, and you could tell, even though, you know, Asian skin tends toward golden, I was totally yellow, in a sort of much yellowish hue. And I was exhausted, like a liver trouble, you know, jaundice. I had no energy to even walk around, and I would sit where I was with my relations, where we took refuge. I was not able to go to a school. I missed most of my school days because of that. It was in a sort of like a top of the mountain type of a place in a town called Kabe, quite a bit away from Hiroshima. And I noticed where I was, you know, exhausted and ailing. Some of the people who had been in Hiroshima were dying with thyroid blowing up, high fever, and then bleeding from all orifices, and having red spots all over. We didn't know, you know. We were even worried about mosquito bites if it was a start of the radiation sickness. We didn't have that word. We didn't know it was atom bomb related, because only those people who barely survived, but not really. It was like you were not well. People suddenly then died. Even those who came to look for their kins into the city had the similar kind of a reaction.
Hideko Tamara Snyder,
Yeah.
Astoundingly, you would ultimately come to the United States to go to college, Bennett College in North Carolina, and you then got training as a psychiatric social worker. You live in Portland. It's 75 years ago today, as you have told your story to people, to students, to community groups. What message do you have for President Trump today, as many fear the beginning of a new nuclear arms race?
Well, you know, I came to a conclusion, all survivors did. The people of Hiroshima now would like to issue a message that this is a horrific bomb, so harmful and inhumane that a human race cannot live with it. And we want to get that message out to everyone. And my way as a former clinical social worker is to encourage two former enemies, especially, to come closer in what I call collective healings, because there seems to be still anger tied up about the Pacific War against Japanese. And that means they're not healed either. And in our attempt to heal, we have to promote, don't let this happen to you. This is horrible. I chair One Sunny Day initiatives to do that, and I try to bring that which would encourage seeking solutions and seeking treaties and seeking collective approach to be able to live in peace in the world. However, if you are especially pointing me to speak something to President Trump, I would say the same thing. Mr. President, this is unallowable weapon on this earth. Please help us talk it out through treaties rather than intimidating and pushing. Because throughout the history, it's not the intimidator that will start the war and do unwise things. It's the intimidated that would study any of their chances. And if they thought there was nothing, they would strike back with everything possible. And should they have their hand in nuclear weapon, please be prepared. It is a beginning of our end.
Hideko Tamara Snyder, I want to thank you so much for being with us, survivor of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. The memoir recounting that moment is titled One Sunny Day, A Child's Memories of Hiroshima. She's a retired psychiatric social worker, founder of One Sunny Day Initiative's peace education organization. She lives in Medford, Oregon. When we come back, we'll be joined by Greg Mitchell, author of many books on Hiroshima, including his latest, The Beginning or the End, How Hollywood and America Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Stay with us. One pencil, Hibari Misora. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. This is the Quarantine Report. Today marks the 75th anniversary of the U.S. dropping the bomb, the atomic bomb, on Hiroshima. 75 years ago today, ushering in the atomic age, August 6, 1945. This is J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientist credited with coordinating the creation of the atomic bomb, head of the Manhattan Project, describing his feelings as the first nuclear explosion in history lit up the Trinity blast site in New Mexico, the test site, on July 16, 1945.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. That's the scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer quoting the Bhagavad Gita. Well, we turn now to look at how the U.S. government controlled the narrative about the race to build and use the first atomic bomb, especially by controlling how that story was portrayed in the media. This is the focus of a new book called The Beginning or the End: How Hollywood and America Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. The Beginning or the End is also the name of a 1947 movie by MGM. We'll learn more about that and so much more with journalist Greg Mitchell, who's written extensively on Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombings, also the author of Atomic Cover-Up and Hiroshima in America with Robert J. Lifton, former editor of Nuclear Times magazine. It's great to have you with us, Greg. Terrible anniversary, the 75th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bomb, ushering in the nuclear age. Greg, before we talk about the film, The Beginning or the End, that started to recreate a narrative about what happened, for people who are not familiar with what happened then, the significance of J. Robert Oppenheimer, President Truman's decision to drop the bomb, tell us why the bomb was dropped and the criticism at that time through to today that was not so much heard at the time.
Yes, thank you. Happy to be here. Well, you know, the stated reason for dropping the bomb, which has become what I call the official narrative, really to this day, as we've seen again with the media coverage of the past month, was that it was the only thing that could end the war. It saved a million American lives. The Japanese would not have surrendered. We would have had a costly invasion of Japan, and we really needed to drop the bomb. It was the only thing that worked. This came out in Truman's initial statement, where he called Hiroshima a military base. So from the beginning, it was important to communicate to the American people that this was a decent and necessary act. And of course, evidence has emerged over the decades, which shows that there were alternatives. For example, Truman had just gotten Russia to declare war on Japan, to promise to declare war on around August 9th. And there are many people who believe that Japan, including Truman, believe that Japan would have surrendered quickly after the Russian declaration of war. And so there's all sorts of evidence that has emerged that the use of the bomb was not necessary, could have been delayed or not used at all. But what was important was to set this narrative of justification, and it was set right at the beginning. and by the Truman and his allies, and with a very willing media, and then following that, suppression of evidence from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, confiscation of film footage, photographs, censorship office in Tokyo. My book picks up carrying the story to Hollywood, and I think it tells the whole story of this period and what happened in this crucial turning point. Oddly, through this rather entertaining story about this movie, because the way that Truman and the military intervened to make to adjust the movie and totally get the revisions in the script to reflect this official narrative, rather than raise questions about the bomb. And then ultimately, when the movie came out, it was nothing more than propaganda. And so really in the story of this movie, and as I tell in the book, it really reflects so much about this turning point in America where we are set on this path to endorsing the use of the bomb, by most in the media and by, many among the public, are right to this day.
Greg, a very quick thing before we talk about the film. That other film you talk about, the U.S. government secretly filmed the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not just from the sky, but the devastation on the ground, brought that film back to the scientists at Los Alamos who did the Manhattan Project, made the bombs. Right. And the reports are that these scientists threw up. They were vomiting as they saw this film, horrified, not understanding this would ever be used on Japan. Can you talk about everyone from Albert Einstein to J. Robert Oppenheimer and how they ultimately felt that film would be then highly classified for decades? Obviously not incriminating, not sharing nuclear secrets, but because of its huge effect.
Yeah, well, in fact, as the book shows, the MGM movie, The Beginning or the End, was actually inspired by one of these scientists. And there were so many of the atomic scientists who were appalled by what had happened with the use of the bomb and the dangers for the future. And so one of these scientists from from Oak Ridge contacted his former chemistry student, the actress Donna Reed, oddly. And Donna Reed set in motion MGM making this movie.
This is Donna Reed, the famous actress. Her science teacher?
Her high school chemistry teacher ended up in the Manhattan Project. He wrote her a letter 2 months after the bombing saying that she must get Hollywood to make a big budget movie that would warn the world about the dangers of remaining on this nuclear path. And of course, as you mentioned, Albert Einstein was very much allied with that. It was probably the leading spokesman for that. And Donna Reed set in motion where MGM did launch this movie at Paramount. They launched a competing movie with Ayn Rand, of all people, as the screenwriter. So the book talks a good deal about that. Ayn Rand's script was ultimately too wacky, even for Hollywood, and so Paramount then threw in with MGM on their movie, on their terrible movie. But in any case, the scientists a large number of them did very much turn against the bomb, and partly for their troubles, the leading scientists were surveilled and followed, and their phones tapped by the FBI. You mentioned the confiscation of this footage. Just very, very, very briefly, both the elite Japanese newsreel team and then a U.S. military team filmed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the weeks and months after the bombing. The U.S. footage was all color footage. It was probably whenever you see any color footage from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it comes from this U.S. military team. And I told this story first in Atomic Cover-Up, a book I wrote a few years ago, and now I've just directed a film also called Atomic Cover-Up that explores how both the Japanese footage and the American footage was suppressed for decades because it showed too much of the human effects of the bombing. And so that's kind of a related story to my current book, because Hollywood essentially did the same thing. It was different, but it was taking a movie script, completely revising it, changes ordered by even the White House. A costly scene had to be reshot on orders from Truman and the White House. that would explain his decision to use the bomb more favorably, you might say, which MDM did. So, I mean, it's quite an incredible, just that one example among many of a sitting president ordering a movie studio to reshoot the key scene in a movie to reflect more favorably on him and what he did.
Well, Greg Mitchell, I want to turn to the present day and where the U.S. now stands on the use of nuclear weapons, not just 75 years ago, but today. You write that 75 years after the first use of nuclear weapons, it's still supported by a majority of Americans. You cite a recent survey conducted by YouGov and the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists that found that more than a third would support a nuclear strike on North Korea if North Korea tested a long-range missile capable of reaching the U.S., even if that meant the death of 1 million civilians.
Yeah, I mean, what's really driven my work for almost 4 decades now is, people say, why does Hiroshima matter today? Or, you can't change history, even if you could. But the simple fact is that America continues to have what's called a first use policy. It means any president is enabled to order a preemptive nuclear strike. In other words, in response to a conventional war, or as you just mentioned, a threat. Perceived threat from a rival or an enemy. I think most people still think America would only launch in retaliation, but that's not true. We've had a first use policy or first strike policy, and there have been efforts to change it. It's not happened. So we still have a first use president. Now we have a president in the White House who, many people are very fearful of what he might do in a crisis or in response to a tweet even. Not exactly the stable genius that he claims to be. And so we have this policy still in effect. And that's why I keep coming back to Hiroshima every year and in books and articles, is because the media particularly continues to endorse the use back then. Certainly, no president has really come out against it. Top officials continue to endorse it. And the fact that we're making, on the one hand, we'll say we must never use nuclear weapons again; they're too terrible, and so forth. But the 2 times we already used them, was necessary, and so it's this endorsement of the use of the bomb. Then I think we could all rather easily see if we launched another nuclear attack, the same defenses would come out. We have this in our background. We have this in our history. The world largely condemns it, but it is in our history. And at that time,
Greg Mitchell, the number of people who died believed to be over 200,000, the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped?
Yes, 200,000 in
Well,
Hiroshima
I'm
and
going to leave
Nagasaki.
it there on this 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. Thanks so much for joining us.